Now, in Japan, radioactive water is reported to have leaked from fuel pools at the Onagawa nuclear power plant. It's following a violent aftershock measuring 7.1. The plant is less than 100 kilometres from the stricken Fukushima plant, which is still said to be made safe. It's set to be made safe following last month's devastating double hit of earthquake and tsunami. Let's get some more developments on this. We'll discuss how events might develop. Joined now live by Philip White from the Citizens Nuclear Information Centre in Tokyo. So we're now hearing about a leak at another power plant, that of Onagawa, but we know very little at this point. Do you think this could be another case of the government stifling what information that people should be and deserve to be informed of?
I think very little is known about what is really happening inside the Onagawa plant. The focus has been so exclusively on the Fukushima plant, which is certainly in much more serious condition, that nobody has really looked, certainly no independent people have really looked closely at what's happening in Onagawa. Of course, it was isolated by the tsunami a few weeks ago. All around it was devastated. It's hard to imagine that that plant is in a sound condition. 3.5 years ago, large, not as big as this recent one, but a large earthquake hit a different plant in Japan, and it took 3 or so years to bring the first of those back online after extensive inspections, and there's still a lot of criticism about bringing that back online. The Onagawa plant will take at least as long as that to bring back online, and nobody really knows what's going on there.
Well, when you talk about this, we now talk about the Onagawa nuclear plant, of course the Fukushima nuclear plant. You were speaking of another power plant. Why has Japan been so reliant upon nuclear energy, considering its seismic location? There are alternatives.
There are certainly alternatives, but when Japan went into nuclear energy, they first set up a policy about 50 years ago, and they actually started implementing it by bringing on nuclear power plants. 40 years ago. At that stage, they really were determined to go ahead, and any inconvenient information like the vulnerability of plants to earthquakes, the fact that the ground location was unstable, that sort of information was suppressed right from the very beginning.
So you talk about the suppression of information, you talk about this so-called inconvenient information. Now, the Fukushima power plant, that's been releasing what is said to be tens of thousands of tons of radioactive water into the ocean. Japanese officials are saying it's not dangerous, it's not a risk to the environment or to people. Is that accurate? It's hard to believe.
I think the notion that you could just release radioactive material or any pollutant into the sea was rejected a few decades ago. And now, as a sort of inevitable and unavoidable situation, at least they say it's unavoidable, they are being forced to release radioactive material to sea, and so they now are trying to tell people that it's not going to be a big problem. But I mean, it goes against the fundamental principles of environmental conservation. So at that level, I think you have to reject it. But I mean, do they have any choices? We recommended, for example, they bring in barges and tankers and the like and fill those up for the time being. In the long term, this water is just pouring through the reactors. They have to pour water into reactors to cool them, but then that just flows out. And there is no sound solution. There is no safe solution to the situation. It's a case of what is the least worst, and their argument was this was the least worst.
If I may jump in just for a moment here, I'm running rather low on time, but we do know that some of the emergency workers, if not all of them, have been exposed to potentially dangerous levels of radiation at the Fukushima plant, some of them even hospitalized. When you address the morality of this issue, have they just been brought in as the sacrificial lambs in this?
They are sacrificial lambs, there's no question about that. It's a question of whether they're doing it willingly. I really do honour the commitment of those workers. My impression is, and of course I don't have direct contact with them, my impression is that they see this as a duty and that they have to go through with it. I'm sure that they don't all feel equally as strongly in that way, but I regard their actions as courageous. The trouble is that it's going to go on for so long. I mean, you can't just keep pouring people in there and as sacrificial lambs into highly radioactive areas where they're bound to get exposures that are certainly dangerous, if not lethal in the short term. So, but then if you just leave it, if you just abandon the site, then the situation is worse. So I think it's morally wrong that those people should be put in that situation, but the moral responsibility goes back many, many years to the time where they made decisions to build these plants, where new information came in and they didn't respond to it, where they justified continuing with existing standards or only slight modifications to standards.
Well, you talk about continuing with existing standards. You know, we've got the Fukushima power plant, the Onagawa power plant now looking like it's in trouble from the aftershock that came less than 24 hours ago at this point in Japan. Philip White, we're out of time, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Philip White from Citizens Nuclear Information Centre.
You're welcome.